The doors are closed, so I assume we're starting. Hi, everybody. I'm Eric Kobrin. I'm here to talk to you today about the BroBot Distributed Denial of Service botnet. First, I want to say why it is that I'm here to talk about this. So, I'm the senior architect on the adversarial resilience team at Akamai. We work to make sure that our products stand up under adversarial pressure. We apply some interesting analysis techniques. Right? So instead of focusing on things like root cause analysis, which are excellent ways to find somebody to blame, we look at contributing factors and find out what things must go wrong for an accident to occur. And we apply these methods to very complex software systems. If you want to hear a lot more about that and how it's really cool, you can go see Christian's talk. Christian Turnus will be speaking at 4 o'clock over in the Washington room. He's one of the members of the adversarial resilience team, the first, actually. And you can hear a lot more about it there. One of the things that we use when we're thinking about these systems, when we're applying STAMP, is we use system diagrams. And so most of what you're going to see on this board are system diagrams. Try to cram a lot of information into not a heck of a lot of space. I think this thing's default resolution is 800 by 600. So if you find that you're sitting at the back and can't read the words, slide on forward. They get larger the closer you get. There are also people who may have come here to hear a lot of technical details about BroBot. I'm going to be covering some of that, but if you want a really in-depth analysis, I highly recommend that you read the Prolexic paper on BroBot, which includes snippets of source code that has come up and things like that, so you can actually see deep inside of the botnet. So, who here knows what BroBot is? Is there anybody here who's never heard of BroBot? A couple, okay. Is anybody here working in the financial industry? Working for banks? All right. So those are the people who were being targeted by BroBot. And starting last year, they started to see this happen. Right? You've got the general internet, and you've got these denial of service attacks coming in, right? That's how you get to a distributed denial of service attack. It's coming from lots of different places. And it's hitting these financial institutions. They're trying to figure out why. There's a group that claimed responsibility for it, the Al-Qassam cyber fighters, and I'll be talking about them a little bit too. Over time, we realized that these attacks were coming from these virtual private servers and shared hosting providers around the internet. And these different hosting providers were sending out all of this traffic, and it was hitting these banks. And you may be asking yourself, why would a shared hosting provider have a grudge against a bank? And the answer is, of course, that they don't. So we got to see some of this traffic. There are a number of financial institutions who are customers of ours. And because of that, we could see the attack traffic. When somebody tries to attack these institutions, they're actually attacking our servers. It's part of what makes the adversarial resilience team's job interesting. So we tried to answer some questions about this. But most of what this talk is about is not about the DOS itself, but rather the environment that makes it possible for there to exist this distributed denial of service botnet, and why it is that we wound up in a world where people can just choose to, without much effort, harvest large amounts of bandwidth to use in attacking. And it all starts here. People like to have websites. They produce content for these websites, and they hope that somebody will actually look at the content, right? Who here has a website of their own? All right. Each of you, I assume, hopes that somebody will visit your website. And in hoping that somebody will visit your website, you may take a little bit more effort than just hope. Perhaps some search engine optimization, or at least making it so that way your site is indexable. Well, that's part of it. Producers make sites, and their goal is to make the site visible to visitors. A lot of how that happens is that visitors go off to their favorite search engine. I pick on Google because A, they're our neighbor in Kendall Square, and also because they're the largest search engine. If you choose not to use Google, feel free to substitute that logo with the logo of the search engine of your choice throughout the rest of this presentation. The producers really want Google to be able to do this, right? So here's early system diagram, leaving out part of the picture, but you see the potential visitors go off to the search engine, they search for it, and they find the sites, they get to those sites. The way that this happens is that Google, of course, reads these sites. You all know this. Right? Google reads the site. Even though you know it, you may not think that it's really important to how this botnet got created, but it actually is. So bear with me. The search engines index these sites and produce these search results. The producers ensure that the sites that they build are easy for these sites to index. I mentioned that they build these sites, they write these sites, but what does it mean to actually write a site? We used to use tools like Notepad, right? You sit there and use Notepad, VI, Emacs. I use Emacs. And then you sit there and you write these HTML files and you store them on your local file system and you want to get them up to your web server somewhere, and you'd use something like FTP, right? Back in the mid-90s, you're off using FTP to move these files around, and then later on you go use SFTP. But it was really hard to get the people who could make sites that didn't look like that, to people who make good-looking websites, teaching them to use these different editors and teaching them the different languages. That was kind of a pain. And then we taught them all how to use FTP, and then had to come back and tell them later, please don't use FTP anymore. FTP is a horrible idea. Go use SFTP. And that was another nasty transition to go through. So we all came up with something easier as an industry, and that is embed the editor into the site itself. Right, so now you have a content management system. This is great because people who are typing in text can go type in text. People who are drawing the graphics and doing layout can go do that. And everybody was happy, right? You don't have to tell somebody, don't go use SFTP, or don't go use FTP, switch to SFTP. They just use their web browser. You can set it up over SSL. People are using these sites. And by definition, if you're one of these people who was building a website, you already had a web browser, and that's all the tool you need to do this. So it made things easier. So who here who has a website has one that is managed using an online CMS? All right. So parts of this talk are going to be directed a little bit more towards you. So part of the problem with this is that although we had people raise their hand saying that they had one, there are other people in this room who have one who may not know it. Who here has a vanity domain for their email? I have one. I have a few. Other people have them. Having these domains, you may have signed up with somebody who was doing mail hosting for you. A lot of these mail hosting companies do things like give you some web space to use. Thank you, Andy. Give you some web space to use. We found a vulnerability. He can tweet and make my phone very well using it as a pointer. So you wind up with these accidental CMS installations where you had no idea that you have one, you've never administered it, somebody's gone up and set it up in your name, the administration is set up through this vanity domain you created, you don't even know the password, but they might be able to guess it because somebody set it up. They probably set up a username of admin and a password of like ABC123 or something silly, and tell you to change it immediately in that sign-up email that you ignore after you receive it because your mail's working and therefore you don't need to talk to that company anymore. There are a lot of these around, of these unattended CMS installations, and they provide part of the terrain on which this botnet grows, this fertile ground. So even if we have a CMS, we may not know it. But what's actually in the CMS itself? CMS, content management system, nice, short, but what is it? A lot of what it is a base platform. A number of them are this base platform with a plugin layer on top of it, right? Like for extensibility. Mostly, so they have this core platform, these plugins on top for additional functionality, and the content producer goes off and picks these components or fails to choose them. Right? In the case of the unknown install, you don't even know you have one of these. Maybe you didn't actually go and pick all of the plugins, they just picked a default suite. Or maybe you signed up and you intentionally have a CMS, but you're using one of these cPanel hosted sites where they say, click this button to turn on Joomla. And you click the button, Joomla is turned on, and it comes with whatever versions of whatever plugins were in their configuration set up by the shared hosting provider. And so you wind up with all of this inside of your CMS installation. And it's different for everybody. Maybe everybody on the same hosting provider has a similar starting point, but in general, these installations are different from place to place. The interesting thing, though, is that these particular components from the CMS are produced by different people. Right? There's probably a core team somewhere authoring software. Who here is in the business of writing software? I see a couple of people who sort of write software. People over here as well. Your software never has any bugs in it, right? Ever. Right? and managing large distributed teams is something that's really easy to do, so everybody does it, and does it right, and has perfect integration of source control. For anybody who saw the talk yesterday dealing with continuous integration servers on the cloud, you may have some idea of what can go wrong here. We'll get to what goes wrong later. But the important thing to remember is that these aren't all the same people, and they're developing in parallel without communicating with each other all of these different pieces, all these different components that are going to be interacting in your system. A lot of these are folks who are just scratching an itch, right? Where you have somebody who they wanted to do something like let users upload pictures to their site, so they wrote a picture upload plugin, and they don't actually use it. These plugins, they don't actually use it except for themselves, right? They weren't intending for this to be some big system that everybody in the world used. They just wrote it for themselves and then decided to share it. Spirit of open source. It's a good thing to share. But that means that they also may not have been paying a lot of attention to security. These components get distributed, right? So at a particular time, somebody's uploaded their particular configuration for a plugin and winds up on a distribution server somewhere. And then the site owner, the producer, the admin goes off and grabs these components at a particular point in time. And they have to put them somewhere, and back to the beginning. We talked about those shared hosting installs. They put them somewhere, and you put it someplace easy. You put it someplace that has a nice big pipe, for example, because you really need your cat blog to be really, really fast. So you go and get one of these virtual private servers, and you install it there, and you're all happy, because everything seems to be working just fine. So let's look back at the system diagram and talk about the principles we have so far. We have search engines doing their indexing, we have people visiting sites, we have people writing content and configuring sites, and we have people writing software that powers the engines through which these people write the content and publish them to their websites. And all of this is living on this shared infrastructure with nice big pipes. You can think of it as sort of the high ground on the internet. The problem with operating there on the high ground is that it's valuable terrain. I mentioned earlier that all software has bugs. Of course, all software has bugs. Bugs introduce vulnerabilities, holes. When people are selecting the software, they're selecting it at a point in time, meaning that if I go and choose to install software today, I get today's bugs and today's features. And if I download the update that you release tomorrow, I get tomorrow's bug fixes and tomorrow's new bugs. So each of these is a different horrible mess of different versions of different plugins and core systems and things like that, each of which introduces different vulnerabilities. And in some cases, the things that I'm calling bugs here aren't what you might consider a bug. You consider a bug, your software goes wrong. Sometimes these things are from component interaction events. This is one of the reasons why we applied system theory in thinking about safety. You might have that plugin that I mentioned earlier for uploading images. You might have another plugin that allows you, to, as the administrator, to upload some custom PHP files to extend your software, to add some custom functionality now. The problem is, if the person who wrote each of those, if they didn't coordinate at all, there's a decent chance, at least in the current plugins that I've seen out there, that using the image upload plugin, you'll be able to now upload PHP files that land in that other directory where the other plugin will happily go and execute them, right? There's a vulnerability. Each of those pieces of software is operating exactly as intended, right? There's no bug in either of them. The problem comes in the combination, when the two components operating as intended interact badly, leading to an accident. Earlier, we talked about the desire of the content producer to have their site be easy to index by search engines. While content from the site gets picked up by the search engines, the hallmarks of those vulnerabilities, the bugs, even something as simple as just version numbers escape, and those get indexed as well. And this means that you have these vulnerable CMS installs, which means that you have a vulnerable shared hosting server, and the things that you can use to find those wind up in the index of the large search engines. From that, folks like the Al-Qassam cyber fighters go and do some reconnaissance. Right? They call themselves the Al-Qassam cyber fighters, and they've claimed responsibility for these attacks in the financial industry. They can go and use a search engine of their choice, do some reconnaissance, search for those little markings, those little tiny markers that say somebody's using PHP upload script 12345, and they happen to know that that one's vulnerable. Maybe there was already a CVE published for it, or maybe they just looked at the code or encountered somebody who used it. And they can then go from that to exploiting those vulnerabilities. Those vulnerabilities are on the system. Doesn't take long for somebody to exploit them. Now, these folks own all of these machines. You've gone from a vulnerable CMS to a compromised CMS, and they've recruited those botnet for use in their attacks, and they just run their attacks by sending commands to your computers, and then have those do the attack for them. And this is why, of course, earlier when we were looking at it, the banks were seeing that they were being attacked by shared hosting providers. So looking at the larger picture, where we have added back in the bank, Al-Qassam cyber fighters, you can see the bugs getting distributed and getting picked up by the index, and the exploits being used to gain control of the server. And then after it's been exploited, you see commands going and the botnet code actually running. For us to get into this world, many things had to go wrong, right? There isn't one root cause. I can't say, oh, well, the problem is QCF, or the problem is the shared hosting providers, or the content producers, or the site owners. Something had to go wrong at half a dozen or a dozen different places for us to wind up in an environment where somebody who wants to can go and use people's benign web servers as the source of their attacks. Things that go wrong include things like having the bugs, not patching, having a desire for easy searchability, having a desire for a high bandwidth connection. You as a site owner have a desire for a high bandwidth connection, so does somebody who wants to perpetrate a denial of service attack. Right? If the thing that's limiting their attack is how much bandwidth they have, going after these makes it really easy for them to succeed in their attacks. Let's look at a couple of different subsections of this view of the world. First, starting off on the area between Al-Qassam cyber fighters after they've already compromised the machines. We've already talked about how they get into it. Let's talk about, in particular, what they're asking these machines to do and how they're harming the banks with it. Again, you can get some much more detailed information that I'm going to present in this talk by reading the Prolexic report, which has lots and lots of text. It doesn't all fit on the screen, of course. You may also wonder how we found out about these, how we found out exactly what's happening on these attacks. If you go and search for, pick a CMS, Joomla or WordPress, and search for hacked, you will find forums from people who use these services. And they will say, my site got hacked, my bandwidth bill went through the roof, or my CPU usage is going crazy and they turned off my website, things like that. And they'll go back and they will say, I got these weird files on my server now. Well, those weird files on the server are the components of this botnet. And you'll see them around. You'll see people complaining about it. They post the source up. Sometimes it's up on paste bins. Sometimes it's up just in the forums. But you can actually go through and read what it is that they do and how it is that they do what they're doing. This is a simplified view of that. The parameter names and things are obfuscated in the actual code. But here, a basic simple view is that it's a piece of software that has 3 actions it can take. It can do a health check. If you're managing large networks of systems, right? If you have a few tens of thousands of computers, you need to find out some way to find out how they're doing. Right? Are they still responding to commands, etc.? So their health check responded with, it's okay, no problem, bro. That's how you wind up with the name BroBot. Also, they had 2 basic attacks that they could do, a UDP flood or an HTTP flood. Either way, sending lots and lots of attack traffic. The numbers are actually incorrect. But sending large amounts of attack traffic to a target. Target host, target port, target path. So actually the early versions, it was just the target host, the target port, and a loop count. How hard do you want to hit this? And so you can use this to probe somebody's defenses, right? Send them a short burst of traffic and see whether they blocked it or not. And then you can use it to actually do the attack. You go and you ask the compromised CMS server to go and send massive amounts of traffic. And you actually don't ask one of them, you ask a couple thousand of them to do it. As people got better at blocking these, the adversary had to adapt. And that's actually one of the things that's one of the troublesome parts of this entire system, is that there's feedback loops. And if we're not careful in our defenses, we provide evolutionary pressure to the adversary to become stronger. And that's what happens here. They evolved. The later versions, or at least later discovered versions of this source, had a health check that responds with kamikaze rather than it's okay, no problem, bro, and had a distribution system for taking work and sending it off to one tier of these compromised servers, and then having those compromised servers call on another tier of compromised servers to send the actual attacks out. So instead of having to have your own machine, let's say I'm operating the botnet, I have my own laptop. Instead of having to connect to 5,000 machines to do the attack, I connect to 5 machines and tell each of them to go off and contact 1,000 machines to do the attack. And it allows you a little bit more flexibility. It also has just the 2 attack types. The one is distribute, and the other one is to execute. And so this is more what their system looked like, right? The later versions of it, the more recent ones. It allows you to have easier control. You have to send less, fewer signals transmitted from your command and control infrastructure to the botnet, to the outside of the botnet, and then the botnet does a lot of communication internally and then sends massive amounts of traffic outbound. These are some of the details of the early attacks. The earlier attacks appear at the top, the later attacks appear at the bottom, although they aren't limited in any way, right? These are human beings making choices. They can, if they find that some of the earlier techniques are effective again, they try them again. Right? So they can go back and forth, but these are in the order in which we first started seeing these attacks coming from this botnet. Early one was simple UDP. Let's send a giant blob of the letter A and see who we can knock out with that. Later on, they started moving into HTTP. So now they're doing TCP connections. It's a little bit more expensive for them, but it's not their machine, so why do they care? And they were just trying to get the root page. And then going off and trying to hit some particular paths that they expected to be more expensive. And eventually moving into sending arguments in those HTTP requests in the form of query parameters or post parameters, trying to exert maximum cost on the origin server for the effort that they expend. In these attacks, especially the more recent ones, they started also playing all kinds of games with headers. Right? Who here looks at or has some software that looks at, for example, the X forwarded for header? Right? So you've seen X forwarded for, you know it indicates, okay, there's a proxy here and the traffic really came from so-and-so. Well, if you look at their source code, they were picking random numbers and putting them in X forwarded for. So just 4 random octets. Some of these were obviously wrong. Nobody's actually forwarding traffic for 0.0.0.0. But that's what they were doing in order to fool software out there, right? If you had a web application firewall, or if you had some kind of intrusion prevention system that was paying attention at this layer, it might be fooled by what they were doing in these headers. Also, if you had a caching layer, perhaps some of these are important to that. And so they were changing these around, trying to do some, I think they also did if modified since request, but I don't have details on that on here. But in any case, they sent lots and lots of different values for these headers, trying to fool any protection mechanisms that existed in between the attacking server and the origin server, their target. They also started playing games with those parameter values. So some of the early ones, they just picked real parameter names out of existing URLs, go to a bank, click around for a while, find a URL with some question mark in it, and just start changing those values in the URL to random values. Later, they started using random parameter names because they found that was just as effective, and it allowed them to have many, many more unique URLs. And then eventually they realized that for a lot of these servers, you didn't even have to supply a value to get the cost out of it. You could just use lots and lots of random names. So they started leaving the values blank. And they would send those either over a GET or a POST, and they also started using SSL, which makes it a little bit harder for people monitoring to see what's inside. Also makes it a little bit more expensive for the servers and more expensive for the client, but once again, the client is borrowed. So from that, we want to figure out how to stop these. Right? So this is not an ad for Akamai. I'm just talking about how we see the traffic. It's aimed at our customers, and we had a desire to prevent this malicious traffic from hitting our customers without blocking the legitimate traffic. Right? There are plenty of other services out there that might have these same goals, might try to achieve them. I know about how we do it. But I'm not really going to get terribly much into the specifics, only to indicate that there is a balance that you have to deal with here. You don't want to overblock and prevent legitimate traffic from getting through. So we've looked at what QCF does. Let's talk about the bank. What can the bank do? So here we start getting into some of the things that you can do if you're one of the targets of these attacks. If you're a target site being attacked by this or perhaps a different botnet in the future, somebody's trying to DOS you, you start off by building a defensible infrastructure that you can then layer on defenses afterwards, right? So this comes from things like knowing your application parameter names. If you are developing software and you know the parameters that will be accepted by any particular URL, you can go and push that check out further away from your infrastructure. You can use dedicated hardware. You can use something like Akamai's Kona services. You can use one of our competitors' services. You can move that out so that the checks happen not on your hardware. And your hardware stays up and you keep serving your legitimate customers because at least some subset of illegitimate traffic was dropped further away from where you are. If you don't actually know your applications, if you haven't built a defensible infrastructure, you're stuck doing things like analyzing patterns of traffic and guessing. And you have to use lower value tactics in order to protect yourself. And you might find that you're getting more false positives or more false negatives as you do this. So my instructions for people who are building sites who believe they will be experiencing an attack or who are experiencing an attack is to listen to Josh Corman and Gene Kim. Josh is sitting over there in the corner. I have the great pleasure of working with him. Not knowing your parameters, right? We had this happen where customers will say things like, I can't possibly know what all my parameters to all of my pages are. Well, imagine that you are talking internally to your own developers, right? Talk to your developers and they say, yeah, I don't know what parameters my functions take. I just take a big blob and grab whatever I want out of it, right? All of my functions just take a hash and I just grab whatever I feel like out of that. That would fail code review. You wouldn't let somebody like that stay at your company if they persisted in engineering software that way, because it's not engineering. It's a hodgepodge. It's a mess. You can't reason about the software. And instead, what we've done is we've said, oh, it's on the internet? That's fine. You don't actually have to know what your software does. And that leads to this kind of world where you can't defend your software because you don't know what it does. Forget knowing what the parameter types can be. A lot of people don't even know what parameters might arrive legitimately at a particular location. So start there if you're in one of these positions. Start building better, more defensible software, and it'll be easier for you to protect yourself at lower cost to yourself. So we've checked out QCF, the code that they've installed on people's servers, and what the banks can do to protect themselves. Let's talk about another group. Let's talk about people who have these websites, or who are operating these shared hosting environments, or who are authoring these CMSs in the first place. I consider these guys the folks who are fertilizing the ground on which the botnet grows. If you're a user of a CMS, sorry, I managed to jump ahead. There you go. If you're a user of a CMS, keep your servers patched. Right? So I'm not trying to sit here and tell you, you ought to do this, you ought to do that. I'm talking about a description of a world where in the future we can provide smaller footholds for people who want to use our own infrastructure against us. You can choose to do this or not to do this. If you have an interest in making the internet a better place, if you have a desire to make it so that way people can't use the services that you pay for to harm other people, here's a list of things you might want to try. Right? Keeping your servers patched, going through and adding things like outbound firewall rules yourself. Right? Say, look, I'm operating a cat blog. My cat blog has no need to make any HTTP calls outbound from the server, so it's not allowed to talk to anybody. And then your problems, your particular install becomes less desirable as a target for these folks. You can start off by trying to keep things clean, to fix your infections, but limit them first. I think limiting is a really good way to start. If you make it so that way, if you assume that at some point you will have an open vulnerability on your server and that you will be compromised, making it so that way it's a lower value compromise makes everybody safer. If you're one of these shared hosting providers, a lot of these shared hosting providers, what they do is they start off by handing you a very large gun and pointing it at your feet as the customer. These are the ones who go off and say, yes, we're going to install an instance with a well-known username and password and not tell you that you have it. Right? You signed up for mail, we give you web hosting. If you have, in other cases, they give you some software to install where you can click a button to do it, which is better, right? If you're operating a shared hosting provider, anybody here work for one of the big shared hosting providers and is willing to raise their hand? Okay. For those who do, or if you have friends who do, you can talk to them about requiring positive action. Again, this is for people who are interested in making the internet a safer place. If you require positive action from your users to enable services, just like, say, if you're installing OpenBSD, you have to turn on services. It doesn't come with the services enabled, the remote services. You've made it so that way an unattended install that doesn't get patched and doesn't get used also is of no use to an attacker. Right? They might be able to break into it and use it for computation. Maybe they're going to use it for hash cracking or something, but they can't make use of that pipe. They can't make use of the bandwidth that you've made available. Here at this layer is where, once again, as with the banks, we can avoid applying evolutionary pressure. So if you're one of these institutions under attack, it's a really good idea to block this traffic in a way that isn't obvious to the people who are attacking you. Right? If you go and say to them, haha, we know you're BroBot and we don't want you to attack our servers, so we're denying your traffic, they now know that they have to adapt again. If, as an example, you never send them a reset and just ignore the connection, they don't know whether it worked or not because that looks like a heck of a lot like a successful denial of service. Right? If somebody sending you DOS traffic experiences a response from you that indicates that you have been DOSed, they win, they walk away, they're happy. The rest of your customers are happy too because they have no idea that this happened because it didn't actually succeed. You can do this at the VPS layer as well by working on ways to make it so that way it might look like your customer hit a bandwidth cap and that's why the traffic isn't going outbound, rather than declaring, hey, this is malicious traffic, we're not going to forward it. Let's also talk about people who are writing CMSs. I know there are people around here who contribute to open source software, and this applies to basically anybody who's doing software development. But in particular, for this environment, I'm talking about authors of CMSs and authors of CMS plugins. Using the secure development practices that we've heard, you've probably heard talks about it here and at other conferences. It's easy to learn about, it's easy to find people willing to talk to you about secure development. Finding the particular right tactics is an entirely different presentation. But some of the easy things to do are to provide safer defaults, right? So starting off with realizing that you've built a platform, right? So you've built this platform, and maybe you default by not allowing your plugins to write into directories from which the server is willing to read for execution, right? You have a directory that's marked to not enable PHP execution, and you dump all the files that people are uploading into that. Or you do a bogus file system. I've written one of those where I use a database for a file system, right? You take your uploads and you put them in the database, and now if somebody's trying path traversal attacks or any of the other interesting things you'll hear about in the other talks, they don't actually work because there is no actual path to traverse. And you can't actually write into the directory where the PHP executes because the PHP layer can't actually read the database as PHP source. Things like that. But I mentioned that you're building a platform. Other people build platforms. Microsoft famously builds very large platforms. A lot of people use them, or Apple, I suppose. That's what I'm running over there. But Microsoft has their Patch Tuesdays, right? If you're running Windows and you want to keep your system as vulnerability-free as possible on average, you accept those patches on Patch Tuesday and you run them and now your vulnerabilities are gone. Well, what if you're a CMS user? Is your CMS provider giving you their version of a Patch Tuesday? Is there a particular time that you know you can go and get the latest version of all the stuff and not break your current code and close off some vulnerabilities? And most of them aren't doing this. And so I would ask that people who are in this business of building CMSs, building plugins, building these platforms that people use that are the infrastructure of the next generation internet, that you actually go and consider yourself a platform and do the things for your users that you would expect the platforms you use to do for you. If you can't go and offer people patches and automated updates, and you can't follow the path that Chrome pushed and that Mozilla followed, at least you can offer a mailing list for security updates. Hey, we found a vulnerability. If you're going to download our software, you sign up for the mailing list at the same time, and we promise to only send you security updates through this mailing list. Right? Make that available. Right? You don't want people to be people thinking that you're going to spam them. We're just talking about important notices about ways that you can use software to fix bugs or change configurations to fix bugs. You're in a very powerful position. We talked about this being the infrastructure of next generation websites and things like that, but it's also people who are authoring these CMSs are shaping the future botnets of the world. Right? This is your opportunity to change what botnets look like next year. So here's that big view again. Each of these little orange X's indicates one of the places where I've discussed a potential mitigation. Right, you can see the whole flow through people searching and indexing and writing software and using software and failing to patch and so forth. And you can see all of it. And you can see all these different spots where somebody might choose to stop the attack. Here, the VPS provider doesn't allow the attack traffic to leave. Or here, maybe they don't allow the command and control traffic to enter. Maybe we patch these bugs so they don't actually run. Here in the distribution system, perhaps automated distribution is made available, or agreements with the shared hosting providers, so that if the hosting provider is giving you an install of Joomla or an install of WordPress or one of the other CMS systems out there, perhaps they take the patch on your behalf by having agreed with the CMS developers. There are other places in here where you might be able to stop this. And I talked about how so many different things have to go wrong and sort of avoiding the blame mentality that root cause analysis leads us to. And talking instead about a system. Right? I'm not saying, hey, we should all focus on doing this. I'm saying, look, if the VPS guys take care of this piece, and the site owners start patching, and the DDoS protection companies start applying DDoS protections that don't cause the adversary to advance, and the CMS people start writing better tech, each of these things now is ground lost by the botnet herders. They don't have this anymore, right? Once this piece is gone, they have to find some other way to get vulnerable software onto people's servers. Once people are patching their servers, they have to find some other way of getting a hold of the bandwidth. And so by taking apart each of these different contributing factors, you can actually make things, you can make the entire system safer. But I didn't cover all of them. You'll note I didn't talk at all about what the search engines can do. I'm sure people here can think about things that search engines might be able to do to make it better. And of course, there are positives and negatives to changing your search infrastructure. But there are plenty of other layers in here, right? No system diagram is going to cover absolutely everything. I mean, somebody's providing the connectivity upstream here. They might be able to do something. Somebody's providing power. We could go turn off, install a kill switch for anybody running a botnet. But aside from that, these are the key pieces. This is the system, and that's my talk. Any questions? Got one in the back?
I understand that the robot is a little bit different from the scale compared to, say, earlier or other botnets that have been there. Can you talk a little bit about what's different about the robot and what we're used to?
Sure. So some of the our earlier botnets, you saw a lot of spam botnets that use people's laptops, right? Or people's home computers as a place from which to send spam. Home computers typically have a fairly limited uplink, fairly limited in their ability to cause harm to the rest of the internet. Right? Your ISP can throttle you pretty easily. The key difference here is that they chose people who were guaranteed to have a large pipe. And it's not perfect, right? You go and compromise 100 blogs, they might all be running on the same server. But you go and compromise 5,000 blogs, and you know you probably got a pretty good spread, different points around the world where you can attack. And that's what made a big key difference here, is that they chose targets that would have good connectivity, that probably had terms of service that made it hard for that connectivity to be disabled. This is one of the other things that the VPS providers can do, is to make the terms of service different. So if you're sending malicious traffic, we can turn you off more easily. And they chose those targets, and that's why they were able to send so much traffic this time around.
What kills me about this one is that all that unwanted, unknown, elective attack surface of services, it's like a public health issue. I think we have this rich fertile swamp in which to have all these free, right?
Yes, it absolutely is a public health issue. And And I know in Florida, I grew up in Florida, if you don't put chlorine in your pool and your pool turns green and mosquitoes start breeding in it, you get a ticket. All right? If you provide a breeding ground for mosquitoes, you get a citation from the code folks who come around and you have to pay them something like $300 and go fix your pool. So we don't have anything like that here. But really, these guys are operating an attractive nuisance, right? And they didn't know about it. Maybe they can claim ignorance. But it's still the case that you're operating an attractive nuisance by having an unpatched server with high CPU and high bandwidth capabilities. And it's really what it comes down to. A friend of mine calls these, if you'll pardon the phrase, the syphilitic whores of the internet. These guys are here spreading disease like crazy and interacting with any other server they can get their hands on.
Do you think it's more irresponsible of VPS providers to be providing auto configuration, one-click CMS setup and stuff like this, or the CMS creators in the first place for enabling that sort of ecosystem, not making you more aware of vulnerabilities, the potential vulnerabilities you're opening yourself up to by running a PHP CMS?
So responsibility is an interesting question. Responsibility ties in with delinquency, right? You have a duty and you've been delinquent in your duty, right? There's been some interesting writing on this, and there's an idea of if you're not aware of your duty, are you actually being delinquent in it? And a lot of these are cases where there are actually kids writing these. I mean, I know I was writing software when I was a kid, and I had no idea about any of this. I was writing software completely full of holes, horrible stuff. And I was sharing it with my friends because they wanted software that would do cool things. My software did cool things, and I didn't know anything about the absolutely horrible things that my software would let them do. More irresponsible. I expect that the shared hosting providers today should know better. If you'd asked me this question 10 years ago, I would say, oh, it's the fault of the CMS install folks who installed this on their machine, right? The user, blame the user, but the user is just another victim here, right? There's a lot of victims in this. But rather than thinking of victims, we can think of who is in a position to help. Or it doesn't matter whether you were irresponsible for writing the software or irresponsible for letting people do this. You're now in a position to help. There is a crisis going on. Stand up and help, even if it isn't your fault, or even if you don't think it's your fault. Anything else? Got another one over here.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. On a couple of slides, you talk about don't help attackers down.
Right.
Or things like attack. So I'm wondering, first of all, how is that done? Where is that data coming from? And how often does that happen?
All right, so there are different industries that are better at this than others in terms of not helping the attacker adapt, largely because of how long you've been under attack and aware of it and dealing with your adversary. Right? So if you've been writing software for an industry that routinely gets these kinds of things happening, you've probably learned some tricks already. But thinking like an adversary, this is one of the things that I hire for. Right? I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the adversary resilience team, of which this is an example of the kind of output we produce, we have openings, and we're hiring people who have this adversarial mindset. Thinking like the adversary, some of it comes from having been one of the bad guys at some point. There are people around who started off on the smash and grab side of things and then decided they wanted to defend. Sometimes people just look at systems differently. It comes out of the hacker mindset. It comes out of the example that I give when people ask me, what do I mean when I say I'm looking for hackers? I give an example out of sailing. I was off, my father and I were doing a race down in Biscayne Bay, down in Florida. Beautiful waters if you've never been there. We're off sailing in our boat. You may wonder what boats have to do with computers, and the answer is, in this case, there wasn't a computer on that boat, I don't think. This was a while ago. We were off sailing, and we go to make a turn in some shallow water. And we push the tiller over, and the boat doesn't turn at all. And what happened? Well, the rudder had snapped off at the waterline. Right? So here we are, we've got no steering, and we don't know what to do. The rudder's floating away, or at least I didn't know what to do. What my father did is he dives down into the cabin. He comes back with 2 C-clamps and a cutting board. And he clamps that cutting board onto what was left of the tiller and sails us home. We got home safe. We took the race flag off the boat, stuck it to the car antenna, and drove to the finish line. So it's about looking at things in terms of what they're capable of doing as opposed to what they're designed to be used for, right? CMS. totally designed to be used for publishing material, managing content. What can it be used for? Wow, I can operate my own cloud services system and not pay for any hardware, right? It's about looking at it, just sort of turning it 90 degrees and looking at it sideways and figuring out how else could I use this particular gadget. And we're pretty close to the end of time. I'll take one or two more questions if we have them. Otherwise, thank you for attending. How much damage have they done? So this is hard for somebody who works in a security field at a company selling security services, right? They've increased the size of our team. But damage that they've done is pretty large, right? There are banks that were going offline. They're changing their targets. They advertise what their targets are on places like Pastebin because they are actually trying to send a message, or claim to be trying to send a message at least. And so you can go and read what they're doing and why they're doing it. And you can see these banks go offline as they adapt to the defenses and come back up. But people are experiencing millions of dollars worth of harm here. Yeah, so they're no longer announcing in advance who they're going after, but the patterns are similar, right? If you're operating one of these sites and you have been attacked, you can probably guess that it's at least the same kind of software being used against you. You can analyze your traffic, right? Even in those cases where it's encrypted and moving across systems that somebody along the line couldn't analyze, you yourself, if you're one of these banks, you can read the traffic coming in and say, wait a minute, this looks just like that stuff that hit us the last time they said they were going to hit us. Is it necessarily the same people? I'll leave that to others to figure out. But the defenses are similar, certainly. I believe they're choosing the targets they're choosing because it gets noticed, right? When your stated goal is to send a message, you want to be visible, you pick somebody who people are going to notice, right? In their earlier statements, they said they were going to attack US financial institutions until some videos were removed from YouTube. Whether you believe that or not, it's up to you, but that's at least what they said. They then stopped attacking, claiming that the videos had been removed. But they attack people who stay down. That's one of the keys. I mentioned earlier how you can attack for a short period of time or a long period of time. They use some of these early attacks to see who's actually already set up for defenses. Right? If they go and attack you and your site stays up when they send you a short burst of traffic, they move on to the next guy. And they do that until they find enough targets to satisfy their needs. Once everybody has moved up a level in terms of defenses, they up their game and go sweep again and see who they're able to take down with their new attack. And they decide how many they're going to need and go do that. Do I believe they're operating at capacity? Absolutely not. Anybody in this room who has written PHP can probably read their code and write better code. But is it really better if it's achieving their needs? Is it bad code? Yeah, I think it's objectively bad code, but it's the tool that they wanted, it's the tool that they have, and it's doing the job they need it to do. So I don't have any illusions that they've reached the limits of their capacity in this. All right, and we have 1 minute left. I'll take one question if there is a single question, otherwise we are done. Feel free to come find me afterwards if you have more specific questions that you want to discuss. I plan to make at least this part visible to anybody who wants it. If you haven't already, snap the picture. So, thank you, everybody.